we're going to be looking at how we can bind user input in C++. So we're going to be dealing with a completely different class in this module. We're going to go to the content core and look for our BP underscore first person character. Now in the event graph here, you'll notice we have got a bunch of input bindings, these input axes, and down here a few input actions. We're going to look at how we can bind actions and axes in C++, but the first step is going to be creating a C++ base class for our first-person character. So let's do that. I'm going to go to the Add New button, a new C++ class, and we're going to base this class off of character, which I believe is the same base class. Let's just go and check. Yes, the base class is indeed character. So new C++ character, next. And then I'm going to put it in the root, and we're going to name it the first person character, and we're going to go ahead and create that class. Now, when that's finished building, you'll see something a little bit like this. Now, it's got your constructor begin play tick, but also it's got a new function called the setUpPlayerInput component, and it takes in this player input component. So this is what we're going to be using to set up all our bindings. Basically, you use the player input component to bind the different axes. Before I show you how to do that, let's make sure we have reparented our blueprint. So we go over to the BP first person character, to our class settings, and in the parent class dropdown, we're going to look for the first person character and just reparent to that, compile and save. Now, the first example I'm going to want to show you is an input axis, our input axis forward. Now, in order to call some code in C++, we're going to need a function. So let's go over to the header file for our first person character and create a private section down at the bottom here, which we're going to create a void function called forward, which is going to do just that. And that function is going to take the axis value in as its argument as a float, which I'll call the axis value. And then we can go ahead and copy the signature over into the bottom of our C++ file like so. Now to actually bind that axis, we go to our setUpPlayerInput component function, and we do a player input component. So we use that variable that was passed in as an argument, arrow bind axis. Now, bind axis at this point isn't auto-completing for us, and the reason for that is we're not having the correct include for U input component. So if you looked in the documentation, you'd see we need to hash include components / input component.h. So now that we've got the include, we can go ahead and add in the arguments to bind axis. Now, my autocomplete isn't showing it here. It may well do for you, but the first argument has got to be the name of the axis we're trying to bind with. So that's going to use the text macro. And as we can see, if we go over to the blueprint, you can see that the axis name is forward. The clue is there in the event. Another way of finding that out is going to your main map and settings and having a look at your project settings. Then scrolling down to the engine input section, and you can see where all the action mappings and axis mappings are in here. So you could actually just copy the name of the axis that you are trying to bind to. So in this case, it is forward. The next argument is going to be the object that we need to call this axis function on. So it's very much like binding the dynamic delegate. We want to pass in this, and then the actual function itself, which is going to be our first person character, : forward, and we're going to want to ampersand before that. Put a semicolon, and let's build and see if this works. But first, we need to put something in our forward to see whether it's actually working. So I'm going to put in a print statement. So a UE_log, and then we're going to use a log temp category, and we're going to make it warning level so that we can see it and it highlights in the logs. And then we're going to have a text macro forward with a float argument %f, and we'll pass in the axis value here. Semicolon at the end of the line to finish off, and we'll build and see the results. So if we go back to the editor, to the window menu, we are going to go and look for the developer tools and then the output log. And this is where we're going to see our logging. Let's go ahead and hit play and use our forward. So it looks like our forward axis is not actually doing what we would expect. And the reason for this is that it's currently already bound in Blueprint. So if we go ahead and break the execution link in Blueprint, let's see if that is enough to do it. Go ahead and hit play and use our forward axis. Well, it's not working, but it is not enough. We have to actually go ahead and delete the forward event in Blueprint. So let's go and play now. And forward and backwards, you can see now we've got that log message telling us that the forward axis is 0. Now it's 1, that's when I was hitting the forward key, and then it is -1 when I'm hitting the back key. So that's correctly bound the axis, but how do we go about binding actions? Well, the way we do this is very, very similar. We do a player input component arrow, and we're going to do a bind action instead. And if I go back to the project settings input section again, then in the action mappings, we can see that we want to bind maybe to jump. So we're going to go and paste that into our C++. So it's going to be text jump. And then there's one more parameter here, which is the key of the action. So we have an enum here called input event. And if we hit F12, then we can see that the input event has these options, the IE pressed, IE released, repeat, double-click, axis, etc. Well, the ones you're going to want more often are the pressed and released. And for jumping, we're going to want to do something on pressed. So it's going to be input event : IE pressed is what we're looking for. Then finally, we can go ahead and give it the user object with this, and then we can bind it to a function which we have not yet created. Let's go ahead and create one. It's going to be another private function, void jump. It doesn't need any arguments this time because when you say jump, you don't say how high in this particular instance, and we're going to want to have the implementation of jump. So let's go ahead and copy the signature over into the C++ file and put a log message here as well that we're going to just have jump with no parameters. So we can remove the axis value, and then we can use the first person character : jump, putting the ampersand before it, just as we've done binding all our delegates and action. And if we go ahead and hit build on this, then we should get the result that we want. So let's dive back to the editor, open up the first person character. We said we need to delete the event. The same thing goes for actions. So I'm going to delete the jump event in here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit play and see whether jump is going to work. So spacebar is jump. You can see that there is a log message happening there. There are lots of other log messages though, unfortunately, so it is getting hidden. But if I come out, you can see that if we scroll up, or if we just search through the logs, we should be seeing that there is indeed a jump warning log telling us that our binding has been successful. So to recap, we have overridden the first-person character in C++. We've made that the base class of our blueprint. We've seen how there's an extra method here, an extra callback called setUpPlayerInputComponent, and how we can use the parameter to that to bind to axes and actions in C++. We're going to be rounding up the first-person character class and bringing over lots more of its functionality and properly binding all of its axes.